All right. So this is the royal review. This is the study that we are doing. Okay. Uh, so, like I said, thank you all for joining us this evening. And if you had attended last week, you will remember that we had said that because we started looking at this with the United Kingdom, Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. And most of us, we've heard a lot of Bible studies on Saul, David, and Solomon, right? So, what we will do is for the next few weeks, very quickly, when we look at Saul's life, David's life, Solomon's life, we will look at, some good side of their life and also some bad side of their life. Okay. All of them made blunders. And so we will look at that before jumping into the divided kingdom. Okay. So for the benefit of all of us, we are looking at, the kings of Israel and Judah. And if you will remember, I had already mentioned that at one point Israel was a united kingdom with all the 12 tribes considered as one kingdom, Israel. And Saul, David, and Solomon were the kings of the United Kingdom. After Solomon, and I had already said that Solomon, in spite of being the wisest man alive, অনেক বুদ্ধি ছিল সলোমনের, but in spite of all of that, he made some blunders, and because of his blunders, the kingdom was actually divided. The northern kingdom was called Israel. The southern kingdom was called Judah. And southern kingdom had Benjamin, Judah, all of that on the other side of the Jordan River. Okay. So, like I already mentioned, we've heard a lot of Bible studies on Saul, David, and Solomon. So, we will not look at them in depth. We will only look at some of the good, some of the bad that we see in them. Okay. So, we look at Saul today, and then next week we will look at David. Okay. So, let me read a few verses about Saul, some things that are good about Saul. And then after that, from First Samuel, we'll read a few verses that talk about the bad of Saul. Okay. So this is one account of Saul. Last week in our Bible study, we had already studied First Samuel chapter 9 and 10, where we saw that Samuel had already anointed Saul. Okay, so the prophet Samuel had anointed Saul privately as the king. And we had learned some very nice things about Saul last week. We learned some nice things today as well, but also some not so nice things. Okay, so let's look at First Samuel 11, 1 to 15 first. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabez Gilead. And all the men of Jabez said to him, make a treaty with us and we will be subject to you. But Nahash the Ammonite replied, I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you and so bring disgrace on all Israel. Now, let me take a pause here. See, this Nahash the Ammonite, at that time, remember, these were more like a tribal federation. Okay, these were not kingdoms that we know now. Okay, when we understand kingdoms, we recognize, there's this kingdom, this palace where the king stays, and all of that. But remember, when First Samuel was being recorded, it was more like a tribal federation. Okay, people didn't have palaces like that. Okay, kings would live in tents and stuff like that. So that is how this was a tribal federation. And Nahas the Ammonite was one of those very ruthless, pitiless tribal leader. Okay, and it was very common for him to actually gouge out the right eye of his enemies. So he would attack, they would attack other tribes, and then he would gouge out the right eye. So it was very common historically also in those days for several people, especially living in the borders, to be have a destroyed or gouged out right eye and stuff. So Nahash says the same thing to Jabesh Gilead. Jabesh Gilead actually had some of the tribes of Israel in it. Verse 3. The elders of Jabez said to him, give us 7 days so that we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you. When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, what is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping? Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. Again, let me take a pause. It's very interesting now that Samuel had already anointed Saul. Mane Saul এখন রাজা হয়ে গেছিল, and yet you see that he's doing his regular work. He was returning from the fields with his oxen, right? There was no palace, there was no special tent. He was just like another person. It's just that God chose him to become the leader of the tribes of Israel. Otherwise, there was nothing different about Saul. Okay. So you recognize verse 5. Just then Saul was returning from the field behind his oxen, and he asked, "What is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping?" Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabez had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. So you have 330,000 people. One call from their leader, and there are 330,000 people, soldiers that have come, Israelites who've come. Okay. They told the messengers who had come, "Say to the men of Jabez Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued." When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabez, they were elated. They said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like." Okay, so they just make it up, right? They can't say Saul is coming to save us. So the men of Jabez Gilead said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you." The next day, Saul separated his men into three divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no two of them were left together. The people then said to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Turn these men over to us so that we may put them to death." Now, let me take a pause here. Okay. Again, remember last week, some of you were not able to attend. We actually saw that when Samuel anointed Saul, there were a few people in chapter 10, verses 26 and 27, troublemakers, the Bible says, who said, "We don't want, okay, we despise Saul. How can he be the leader?" They brought him no gifts. And the Bible says Saul kept silent. Saul didn't say anything. Okay. So now there are people who are coming to Samuel and saying, "Who were they? Bring them. We will put them to death." But Saul said, "No one will be put to death today. For this day the Lord has rescued Israel." Again, a very beautiful mark of a leader. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. So this was actually the third time that Samuel goes ahead and anoints Saul. First, it was in private. In chapter 10, it was in public. And then again, it was almost like approving of Saul that, yes, he is the right king. He is the right ruler for the people of Israel. Now, in chapter 11, some very good things we learn about Saul. Okay. But before looking what we learned from chapter 11, I wanted to, just recollect some of the good things we learned from chapters 9 and 10. Remember last week when we came, there were a few good things we learned about Saul. Okay. The first good thing was he was not running after power. See, when he was anointed as king, Saul went about doing his own work. Like today also we saw, right? He was in the field with the oxen. So he was never running after power. He was not obsessed with power. Okay. Very unlike some people who like leadership because they feel it's power, it's influence, it's authority, and all of that. But Saul, on the other hand, was not like that. He had no desire to becoming the king of Israel. He didn't run after power. And so in chapter 10, when Samuel anoints Saul the second time, it is very interesting. The Bible says Saul was actually hiding among the bags. Okay. They couldn't find where Saul is. Everybody is gathered so that Saul will be anointed. And the Bible says he is hidden himself among the bags, right? And so they had to go and bring Saul out. Okay. So you see, here is a man who has no desire. He's not running after power. Beautiful, beautiful character of a leader. The second thing we also understood last week is that Saul never boasted about himself, but he was always approved by the others. So নিজের অহংকারে বেশি কিছু বলেনি, সবসময় অন্যরা ওর বিষয়তে ভালো বলেছে না। When he was selected, actually Samuel says, "Is there anyone like Saul?" He was taller than everyone. So Samuel is saying, wow, this is the guy God has chosen, right? This is the king God has chosen. So you recognize Saul himself never boasted, but it was always others who approved him. He was always, always approved by others. And I think it's a very good thing. As a child of God, we may have different gifts and talents, but never to boast about it ourselves. It is always better that God approves of it. it is always better that others talk about it. It is always bad when, only we talk about that. Doesn't work out. So from last week, from the life of Saul, we saw these good things. He was not running after power. Okay, he was a very humble guy. He was approved by others. He never boasted about himself. And I think these are some of the qualities why God actually selected Saul to be the first king of Israel. Now, from chapter 11, we learn a few other things. Okay, number one, we recognize that Saul was, almost the first person who brings Israel together. He actually united Israel. When you read the Judges, okay, which is again another book in the Bible, when you read the Judges, you recognize that a lot of judges that came, they were tribal leaders, and they would always fight with their own, like, along with their tribes. Okay, so if they are fighting the Philistines, they would take their tribes. You look at Gideon, you look at Samson, it was always a tribal war against the Philistines. Okay, but here is Saul, who does a very beautiful thing. When he has to go to rescue the people of Jabesh Gilead, he doesn't go alone with the Benjamites, because that's his tribe, the Benjamites. What he does, he sacrifices an oxen and then cuts it into pieces and sends the oxen to all the people of Israel, the tribes of Israel. And as a result, in the first warfare, you recognize that, the entire Israel comes together. All the tribes come together, 330,000 people coming and fighting to save the city of Jabez Gilead. Okay. Again, a very beautiful mark of a leader where he brought Israel together. This was the first war together. Again, when you look at the judges, Gideon, was one of those very successful judges. And if you remember, it's very interesting. When Gideon goes and fights the enemies of Israel, he only takes his people and go. And as a result, the other tribes actually had a problem with it. So they came and they actually charged Gideon, saying that, why did you do this to us? You never took us as your own. You've rejected us. You never included us in this battle. But Saul doesn't do that, right? Saul is a person, the first king, who actually does really well to unite whole of Israel. And after this, you recognize most of the battles, he does it together with all the tribes of Israel. So that's a very beautiful thing we learn about Saul. The other thing you recognize, he was a very secured leader. See, the few verses, let me take you back to this. When he won, like I said, verse 13, verse 12, the people said to Samuel, who was it that asked, shall Saul reign over us? Turn these men over to us so that we may put them to death. But here Saul said, no one will be put to death today. For this day the Lord is rescued. Again, a very beautiful leader, right? He's very secured as a leader, does not want to misuse his power. Okay. So even though he had people that did not like him, disliked him, did not support him, but on that day of victory, he said, listen, today God has rescued Israel. I have not done it. God has done it. And as a result, nobody will be put to death. Again, very beautiful. So you recognize that there were all of these good things about Saul. Okay. He was not running after power, never boasted about himself, but others approved of him. He united Israel together, brought them together as a nation. He was a very secured leader and did not misuse his power. Okay. So some really 5 good points about Saul. But then after chapter 11, it's all downhill for Saul. Okay. Because he's becoming popular now. He's now recognizes what it means to be the leader of the people, what it means to be the king of the people. So we will look at some of the bad, chapter 13, starting from chapter 13. Okay, so let me read a few verses. Then I'll share a few bad about Saul. First Samuel 13, 5 to 14. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the Israelites saw that the situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. After Saul offered up the burnt offering, just as he finished making, and Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Now, from chapter 13, like I said, is the downfall of Saul. Okay. Now, one thing we need to remember that when Saul's downfall begins, he actually starts doing everything opposite to his good. So his bad is actually completely opposite to his good. His good was not running after power. He was approved by others, not boasting about himself, brought Israel together, a very secured leader, did not misuse his power. But now his bad is just the opposite. So when you look at chapter 13, what I read, you recognize that, only Samuel as the priest could offer sacrifice, right? Shudu Samuel oy bolidan dite patto. But you recognize Saul is now waiting. He's getting impatient. Samuel has not come. The Philistines are coming against. So he's getting scared. He's stressed. He's impatient. And what he does, he doesn't wait for Samuel, but he offers the sacrifices himself. Okay. One very interesting bad, his downfall was there was a feeling of self-sufficiency that he had. Okay. Suddenly Saul begins to think that, well, Samuel is no longer needed. I am the leader. The people love me. God is giving me victory. So I don't need to wait for Samuel. Now let me start offering the sacrifices. Okay. In Old Testament, the kings were not supposed to do it. It was only the priests or the prophets who could offer sacrifices. Later in the Old Testament, only the priests could offer sacrifices, right? In those days, Samuel was the one offering it. But suddenly you see his first step into downfall because Saul realizes that, oh, I don't need Samuel now. I am self-sufficient. God is giving me favor. The people love me. The enemies are scared of me. I'm slowly beginning to get this favor around. So then the feeling of self-sufficiency just creeps in. Again, a very bad mark of a leader, okay? As children of God, we can never say that we are self-sufficient. Even in this world, no one can say that we are self-sufficient, okay? Some of the, as a teenager, I would listen to some bands, and a lot of these bands, the main vocalist would be very popular, would be the most popular person in the band. And the band would be popular, but, everybody loved the main singer of the band. And after a few years of being in the band, what would happen is that the lead vocalist would leave the band and start off on his own, okay, his or her own, okay, do a solo project. And all of them, without any exception, did not do well. Why? Because somehow they begin to think that they are self-sufficient, that people are actually their fan. People love them alone. They forget that it was always about the band. When the band is together, that is what gives them identity. When they become alone, that feeling of self-sufficiency always results in downfall. Okay. And so in Saul, we recognize that suddenly he realized Samuel is not needed. He's become old. Now I will replace Samuel as the prophet, priest, and king. That was wrong for Saul. Only later we realize there was only one person, Jesus Christ, who was the prophet, priest, and king. In the Old Testament, the prophet was separate, priest was separate, king was separate. In Jesus Christ, all three offices, all three authorities come into one. Okay. So it was in Jesus Christ, not in Saul. So there was this feeling of sufficiency. Let's look at a few other verses to see his downfall. First Samuel 15:17 to 26. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. And he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. The Amalekites, like the Philistines, were another enemy of Israel. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God, at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, I have violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. So, what is the context of it? The context is that when Saul was about to attack the Amalekites, God had commanded Saul to destroy all of them. Kings, their king, the cattle, everything needed to be destroyed. But after getting victory, we realize that Saul did not destroy them. In fact, when you look at verse 20, the Bible says he actually brought back Agag, their king, whereas he was supposed to kill Agag, the king. And as a result, God was very angry with Saul. Why? Because he did not obey the command. God had told, kill everyone, kill all the animals, kill all the cattle. He did not do that. And it is very interesting what he says, right? He comes to Samuel and he says in verse 21, the soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God at Gilgal, not my God. He's saying the Lord, your God to Samuel at Gilgal, okay? So in a way, now he's justifying his disobedience. He's saying, listen, it was for your God that we took all these cattle, we will offer sacrifice. But Samuel said, does God delight in sacrifice? To obey is better than sacrifice. Okay. Suddenly, when you look at this account of Saul, you recognize that, from a feeling of sufficiency, suddenly now Saul is approving his own decisions. Again, very opposite to his good, right? In his good, we saw he was always approved by others. He never boasted of himself. But now you're recognizing in chapter 15, he's suddenly approving his own decisions. He's no longer understanding what others feel, what Samuel would feel, what God will feel. He realizes, no, I am sufficient now. I will offer sacrifices. I will decide what is done by the enemies. And so now suddenly he's just approving his own decisions. Again, his downfall. Let's look at a few other verses. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, this is after David killed Goliath, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. Okay. Again, you recognize from being a very secured leader who did not misuse his power, suddenly he became a very insecure leader. Okay. David killed 10,000. That is what people are thinking. Now, obviously, they will make him ruler. Okay. So it's bad, just the opposite. There was a feeling of self-sufficiency. He started approving his own decisions, became an insecure leader. Few other verses. Now, Saul said to him, this is, to a priest. David had visited the priest. Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse? Gave him bread and sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me as he does today. Ahimelech answered the king, who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair. But the king said, you will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family. Then the king ordered the guards at his side, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. So David was running away from Saul because Saul, out of his jealousy, wanted to kill David. And David actually goes into the house of God and eats bread, and Ahimelech, the high priest, actually helps him out. Okay. So King Saul is very angry. But the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priest of the Lord. The king then ordered Doeg, you turn and strike down the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, and its cattle, donkey, and sheep. So interesting, right? When God asked Saul to do this to the king of Amalekite, he did not do it. But now he's doing this to the priest of God. Men, women, children, infant, cattle, donkey, sheep, everybody was put to that, And again, you recognize with his downfall, suddenly a king who united Israel, brought Israel together, becomes a king who starts killing the priest of God. Okay, no one would want to mess around with the priest of God. Okay, no matter how bad you are, everybody has some fear of God, some fear of the supernatural, some fear of the divine. But here is Saul, absolute no regard, starts killing the priest. Okay, so you recognize somebody was so good and God selected him as the first king of Israel, can actually go down to this much level. And that's the reason, now, dear friends, remember, we can never take our goodness for granted. Why? Because we have to remember it is God's grace, and we need his grace and his help to continue to remain good. The moment we think we are self-sufficient, that is where we will spiral down more and more, and he starts killing the priest. Okay, now with this, I'll finally end with this. Okay, then I'll give the time to Pastor Bhagirathi for leading the discussion. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together that same day. Verse 11 to 13. When the people of Jabez Gilead heard about what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. When you're looking at this last chapter of Samuel, this is the end of Saul, and you recognize that he had a very tragic death, right? God did not help him. All his sons died on the same day. He died on the same day. A very, very tragic death, okay? So you see his good. Somebody was not running after power, approved by others, united Israel, everything. But now you see his bad, okay? Same person, if we are not careful, the same goodness in us can become bad. But here is a very good thing. When First Samuel ends with these verses. Now 11 to 13 is very beautiful, I thought, okay? Why? Because you remember Jabesh Gilead? These were the same people who Naboth had come to attack. And he had said that I will, gouge your right eye. And Saul goes to save them. These were the people. This was Saul's first, one of the first, not the only first, but one of the first military warfares of Saul. And you recognize that these people of Jabez Gilead were grateful for what Saul did even after all these years. And as a result, they actually gave Saul and his sons the respect and dignity that should be given to the king. And as a result, they did that, okay? And so it's a very beautiful lesson for us. Any good that we do, it is never forgotten. God does not forget it. And, the good, we will always reap the goodness of it. We will always reap the fruit of it. And that is the reason in Galatians, Paul says, never give up the habit of doing good, especially to those in the household of faith. Okay. So it's in a very beautiful way that First Samuel chapter, First Samuel actually ends, where the people of Jabez Gilead finally come and show their gratitude to Saul and give him the dignity that a king deserves. Okay. But right before you is the contrast of Saul's life. Somebody was so good can become so bad, right? Felt that he was self-sufficient, started approving own decision, became an insecure leader, started killing the priests, and then had a tragic death, okay? And so for us, hope, it serves as a lesson, as children of God, wherever we are, okay? To avoid this feeling of self-sufficiency, to avoid, this approving own decisions, okay? But always look at the other side, okay? Always better that others approve us than we approving ourselves, not to misuse power. And I think those were some things. If Saul had continued, his would have been a kingship that would have honored God. But sadly, this was a kingship that God rejected. And then finally, David became king. Okay. So next week, when we come back, we will look at some of the good and bad of David. Again, David also, though, received so much of goodness and grace of God, had a lot of bad and negatives in it. Okay. So we will come and see that next week, and we'll hope that we learn something and it would be a blessing. Okay. So that's it for today's study. I'll give over the time to Pastor Bhagirathi to lead us in a time of discussion.